I'm running the Zoom into the field trip today because we have a special change to our usual nature walk lineup. Today, we join Miss Margaret, Archbolds Abrahamson Memorial Environmental Education Intern, as she explores the scrub. Remember, all participants are muted and your video cameras are off. Use the chat button to communicate with Miss Margaret and other participants, and make sure to use all panelists and attendees for everyone to see your comments. Use the Q&A button to ask questions for Miss Margaret and our guests to answer after the field trip. It is a beautiful day today, and I'm going to hand it over to Miss Margaret now in the field. Margaret, are you ready for us?
I am, yes. Let's see if I can, switch this around. There we go. Good morning, everybody. As Laura said, my name is Miss Margaret, and I am the Jill Abrahamson Memorial Environmental Education Intern here at Archbold. I've been working here since about September, but this is my first nature walk, so thanks for joining me. And today we'll be taking a little bit of a different turn than what we usually do. Usually, Mr. Dustin is out here and he is exploring the scrub and he's looking at plants and all sorts of different organisms. But today we're going to do something slightly different. And that is we're going to be talking a little bit of a bigger concept. We're going to be asking, what is science and what does it mean to be a scientist? And we have some cool guests on later to tell us about their research and what it means to be a scientist to them. But right now I'll start with kind of the basics. Growing up for me, I was taught that there was the scientific method in school, and that was really it. That's what science looked like. You set an experiment, and then you ran through it a few times in the lab, and you came at the conclusion, and then you had your answers. But I've had a lot of experience all over the world. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and then I studied science in New Orleans, Louisiana. I worked with wolves in northern Minnesota, and I also studied abroad for marine biology on the Great Barrier Reef. So I've got a lot of experience with a lot of different scientists. And what I found out is that science does not look necessarily just like the scientific method. And there's a lot of different ways to do science. Here at Archbold, if you've been on for a previous nature walk, we definitely have had a lot of researchers come and talk about their science, which is really observation-based. We're studying mostly animals and plants here on our property, and we're observing a lot of what they're doing. So, where do they live? What do they eat? What's their reproductive rate? And so that's because we study a lot of ecology. We're studying animals and plants and other organisms. And to talk about observation, I'll have a video from one of our researchers, Mandy, who came on a few weeks ago. But observation is a great skill because it's something that we can do, we meaning maybe not scientists that are out in the field all the time, but also people at home and amateur scientists, which I don't love using that word because I think that all observation is important, whether or not you're a professional scientist or not. But we'll be talking about observation for a little while, and I'll have Laura play a quick video about why observation is something important, something that you can do at home. Laura, do you have that video?
Hi, I'm Amanda, and I work with the herpetology program at Archbold. And being a scientist, I think, requires you just to observe what's going on around you. So herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians. So if you're interested in that as well, one way you could be a scientist at home would be to observe what animals maybe are in your yard, or as you walk along a nature trail, what animals you see. So if you were looking for amphibians, so that'd be mostly frogs, you'd be wanting to look, they like sitting in these palmetto leaves. So you'd want to look in the palmetto leaves and see if there's a frog in there. And then observe what the frog looks like. Is it green? Is it yellow? The non-native Cuban tree frogs have really big toe pads. So look at the size of their feet. And then a scientist always writes all that stuff down because we can't remember it. There's too much nature to remember all of it. So yeah, write your stuff down. And then you can always share it with another scientist. We call that collaboration. And then you can compare the things you've been observing and see if there's some kind of trend between what you're seeing.
Awesome. So we're going to do exactly what Amanda said right there. And we're going to do our own bit of an observation experiment. I'm going to show you a landscape or maybe something close up. And we're gonna do an activity that Dustin did a few weeks ago called I Notice, I Wonder, It Reminds Me of. So we'll start, I'll show you a landscape to look at, and we're gonna start with doing our I Notice statements. Feel free to use the chat or if you're on Facebook to comment on our Facebook post about what you notice about what I'm showing you. No need to make any inferences, just simply say what you state. So I'm gonna turn this around and we're gonna look down here. I'll give you all a second to look at the area I'm showing you. And again, feel free to use the chat to say things that you notice. I'll start with a few things that I notice. So I notice water. That's the first thing. I notice water and I notice algae and a lot of green plants. I don't know if you can hear, but I notice maybe some frog noises. And I see some dragonflies, some butterflies. I notice a few flowers. Again, feel free to use the chat or the Facebook comments to see anything else that you notice. Another thing that I notice is that there is some man-made objects. There's some non-natural objects. I'm noticing some concrete. I can see some pipes. I can see maybe a metal container of sorts in the corner. And so that will lead me to my next portion of this, which is the I wonder portion. So we're gonna do the same thing, but we're gonna do I wonder statements. So for example, because I saw these man-made objects, I'm gonna say, I wonder, why are there man-made objects? I'm gonna wonder why, why is this pond here? Is it natural? I'm gonna wonder what these plants are. Feel free to share your I wonder statements. Yeah, I see. I wonder what lives here. That's a great one. I wonder, because I've seen this pond multiple times, I wonder where the alligator is that usually lives around here. I wonder if it's underwater or maybe camouflaged in some of these plants. Oh yeah, wondering about water quality. That's a great question. Oh, I see something hopping around in the water. So I'm gonna wonder what that is. Looks like some sort of frog. Too far for me to tell what type from where I'm standing. I mentioned earlier that there's some man-made things here, and I wondered if this pond was man-made or not. And I'm gonna use that to talk about our third part of this activity, which is it reminds me of. And I happen to know the history of this pond. This is actually a man-made pond. It was built in 2011 when the building that I'm currently standing on was built. And it's a retention pond. So it's here in case it rains and our parking lot starts to flood. We have a place for water to go. And that reminds me of retention ponds that I might see in a parking lot or on the side of the highway. Which are not necessarily as pretty as this pond is. And that's because we also put a lot of effort into trying to make this a suitable ecosystem for a lot of different animals to live and not just a place to collect water. So on one hand, it reminds me of the types of, kind of water collections that you would see maybe in a parking lot. It's not very pretty. And on the other hand, it reminds me of the natural swamps that I used to see when I was living and studying in New Orleans. And especially when there's the little alligator out here, definitely reminds me of that. If anyone else has anything else that it reminds you of, feel free to share. So just thinking about what it reminds you of, I'm gonna flip the camera again. Just thinking about, what it looks like, making observations. you know, if I hadn't noticed the man-made parts of this pond, I might not have thought to ask, you know, where did this pond come from and is it natural? And that's a big thing with scientists, is just making these observations and asking questions. Oh, someone said it reminds them of a modernist painting. It is really beautiful. And we've definitely put in a lot of effort to make sure that it's a good ecosystem and, you know, in my opinion, then a beautiful ecosystem. So there's a lot of animals that can live here, a lot of plants. It's a great little ecosystem for a lot of cool organisms in this area. We're going to do the same activity again, but this time we're going to do it at a much, much smaller scale. So I'm going to go and put on our micro lens onto the back, or macro lens, excuse me, onto the back of this phone really quickly. Let's see if I can slide that in. There we go. And I'm going to pull out some rocks that I found, and we're going to look at these much closer. Here, oh, there's my pocket. Okay, there we go. So again, we're going to be doing our, let's see, get good sunlight. Whoop. Our I notice statement. So we'll start again, beginning of this activity. So here's one of the rocks that I found. I'm going to say, I noticed that there are a lot of these lines, almost scratches. They look kind of uniform on this rock. We'll look at a different rock. Ooh, in this one, I notice a lot of holes. You know, pretty varied texture. This one's the same way. Flip around maybe, see what's on the other side. Seeing, kind of looks like a combination of things. Feel free to share your I notice statements. And from far away, these don't really look like much except for just little rocks on the ground, but we're looking up close with this lens. So these are the things I'm noticing when I'm giving it a second glance and looking at it closely. So next I'm doing I wonder statements. I wonder, yeah. Oh yeah, Dustin said, I noticed a fossil, nice. So, you know, I'm wondering, where did these come from? What put these prints on here? Or maybe, yeah, lots of rough edges, not smooth. So I'm wondering kind of what formed these. What are these? Looks like a fingerprint. Awesome. So we're kind of moving into our, it reminds me of. I think this one, Dustin saying, reminds me of a fingerprint. Oh, and good, I wonder if these are parts of something larger. So we're doing, yeah, so, you know, it reminds me of a fossil. Or this one right here, it reminds me of coral reef. This one, does anyone have anything that this reminds them of, maybe besides a fingerprint? I wonder how old they are. That's a great question. A seashell, nice, awesome. So that is actually pretty accurate to what it is. This is limestone, or all of these are limestones, Florida fossilis limestone. And really what this is, it's ancient aquatic material, different shells and types of coral, that if you dug down about 300 feet from where I'm standing right now, you would find underground that they're these ancient sea creatures, essentially. And in some places in Florida, you can just find these on surface level. Unfortunately, not here, but we do have them. Yes, fossiliferous limestone, which is really cool because maybe if you're walking by, you'll see, I'm gonna switch this camera around. So it's cool to take a second look at these and really do some observations, because if you're just walking over a bunch of gravelly rocks, you won't think that much about what it is. And you really take a second look and you do these observations and you ask, you notice things and you wonder, and then you think about what it looks like. We said it looked like a seashell, and that's really what it ended up being in some capacity. So it's really important to do these observations. So this is a lot of kind of what we do on a larger scale here at Archbold. The bird lab goes out, and I've had the opportunity to go out with the bird lab, the herpetology lab. And Also, fortunately, the plant lab, and a lot is observations. You're seeing how tall certain plants have grown throughout the year. You're seeing how many how many eggs a bird has laid in a nest. And for the herpetology lab, a lot of what they're doing is tracking gopher tortoises. So you're seeing where they're burrowing and if they've moved when you're tracking them, and seeing what temperatures they're coming outside of their burrow and things like that. So it's really a lot of observation based, and then you're asking these questions and making connections to different types of animals and organisms. But that's also not exactly what so I'm going to invite a scientist that I admire very much, mostly because she's a wonderful scientist and also because she's my sister, Frances Davenport. And she's going to talk a little bit about her research and how it looks a lot different than necessarily. Frances, are you on?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Margaret, for having me come visit. This has been really interesting. And I totally agree that science is all about observation and sort of thinking about what you see in the world around you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I do that. And since I'm in my house instead of outside, I don't have, I got some pictures to sort of show you what I do. So I will try to share those. Let me see if that works. Can you see some of those pictures?
Yep.
Okay. So as Margaret said, I'm a scientist and I study climate. So what that means is, you probably know what weather is. So weather is sort of, what is it like outside today or maybe tomorrow? What's going on in the atmosphere? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it going to rain? And when we say climate, what we mean is we're interested in studying weather, but over a long time. So instead of wanting to know maybe what is it like outside today, we want to know what's it going to be like outside next year or over many years. And this, the reason we look over these long time periods is it helps us sort of understand longer patterns, and also we can plan for extreme weather. So we might be interested in, say, sort of instead of what is it going to rain today, we might want to know how much is it going to rain this season, or what's the most rain we're going to get in the next 30 years. And that lets us plan for some of these sort of extreme weather events. And you might be familiar with some of these, especially if you live on the East Coast. So things like drought, things like severe thunderstorms, or things like flooding. These are all the kinds of things that I study and that we want to understand so that we can prepare for them when they happen. And another thing that that climate or atmospheric scientists look at is, or try to understand, is why is the weather different in different places? So right now I live in California, but I grew up in Virginia, and these two places are at the same latitude, but they have very different weather and very different climates. So one thing that we try to understand is, why is the weather so different in different geographic locations? So I'm going to give an example about how we observe these kinds of things using a type of weather that you might be familiar with on the East Coast, and that's hurricanes. And hurricanes are really important because they can cause a lot of damage, both to buildings and people, but also to ecosystems. But they can also sometimes bring a lot of rain, which can be good in places and can cause flooding in other places. So hurricanes, when they come to land, they bring flooding from the ocean along the coast. They bring really strong winds, and they also bring heavy rainfall and flooding. And so to understand these hurricanes, we have to observe them. But as you can imagine, that can be kind of challenging. So like Margaret said, you might picture scientists often working in a lab, but it would be pretty hard to study hurricanes in a lab because we can't recreate them. And it can also be difficult to go out and observe them in person because obviously we need to watch out for our safety. But still, we want to answer some questions like maybe why are some hurricanes stronger than others? Or why do some years have more hurricanes than others? And so if we understand these things, we can try to prepare and prevent some of the worst impacts from them. So how do we observe hurricanes? It turns out there are a ton of different ways to observe the atmosphere and the earth around them and the earth around us. So one of them is using airplanes. So we actually have airplanes that can fly through hurricanes. So this is a picture of the inside of a hurricane eye from an airplane. And those airplanes can take all these different measurement sensors like temperature or pressure and that kind of thing. So that's one tool. We also have satellites from space. And so this is a picture of a hurricane from a satellite. And so this allows us to see the whole hurricane, and we can get really great information about where the hurricane is and where it's moving. So satellites are a really cool tool. We have weather radar stations. So those can let us know sort of what the clouds are like, how much it's raining, all of these things. And then we also have some other tools like computer models. So when we still can't observe exactly what we want, we can take the observations that we have and we can take some math and physics equations and we can use a computer to calculate or to make a model of what a hurricane or what the atmosphere is like. And then we can even use like a pencil and paper and do some math and use some equations and physics to help us understand what's going on. And so there's all these different tools we have for analyzing the world around us, and they might not necessarily be what you think of when you think of a scientist in a lab. And so the last thing is that, and this came up earlier in the video, is that science often involves collaboration and working together because we do have all these different tools and they can all give us different information. And so the tools that I use are weather and climate models on a computer. And so I can study climate and extreme weather using my computer, but then I go to conferences and I talk to other people who are out collecting data in the field or in airplanes. And we bring all these observations together to help understand the system a little bit better.
Awesome. Thanks, Frances. There we go. So that's really cool. Her science is definitely a little bit different than ours here because she's not necessarily standing out in the middle of a hurricane. Thankfully, fortunately for me, that would stress me out if she was doing that. But she's looking at these things on a computer, and you might walk past her on a work day and think that she looks just like someone sending some emails, but she's doing really cool science, which isn't necessarily what looks like what we're doing here when you see people out in the field with binoculars and nets and all sorts of things like that. To kind of end us off a little bit, I'm going to invite someone who usually see out here in the field, who's doing a little bit something different than he usually does. That's Mr. Dustin. A lot of people don't know this, but along with being the director of education here, he's also a professional photographer. And he has a really cool project talking about taking portraits, of scientists and kind of asking how to photograph science and how to capture what it means to be a scientist. So Dustin, would you like to talk about your work?
Hey, Margaret, thank you. Hi, everybody. This has been so much fun. I got very excited and I've been writing a lot in the chat because I'm usually not the one who gets to do that. I got my second vaccine shot this weekend and we didn't know how I'd be feeling. I actually feel really good today. But I asked Margaret if she would take over for today in case I wasn't feeling well. And having Frances on was really cool too. They actually have a third sister who's also a scientist. She couldn't be on today, but she builds robots. So pretty cool family. I'm going to share my screen here. And what I want to do is take a look at keep exploring this theme of what is science, what does a scientist look like. I've been taking portraits of scientists, volunteers, artists in the area, all people who work in conservation for like 7 years now, 6-7 years now, and I've photographed 100 people at this point. So here's just a few I've done recently, and then we're gonna look at some photos of children with them celebrating science. So here's Alicia, and she's helping this forest because this forest was too overgrown. So she was part of a team that used prescribed fire to knock back all that extra growth. And now if you went back to the same spot, because this was a year ago, it would be beautiful with all nice fresh green growth there. And maybe some Florida scrub jays have even flown in now that it's not so overgrown. Here's some other recent biologists. These are all people, Scott and AJ both work for Archbold. Seth used to be an intern at Archbold. Now works for the federal government now. And you can see them doing different things. All three of them actually do plant ecology. Scott's out there in a wetland collecting some rare, I think those are sedges that he's got in his hand. And that wooden contraption is for pressing and preserving plants. Seth has a little metal thing in his hand there. That's to scrape off lichen off of bark. And let's see, AJ, you can see she's got clipped on to her pants there a GPS unit, and around her neck is a compass. Some other Archbold biologists with nets, Catherine with a net, Sarah on the left, that big metal pole is for stick it into the ground and take soil samples. And Abe over there's got his data sheets. And again, just more people out in different habitats at Archbold. These are all Archbold researchers. And you can see just a variety of types of things that researchers do here at Archbold or around here, doing stuff with plants, with birds, in wetlands, all kinds of things. Perhaps my favorite part of the project is using those photos to teach and inspire. So here are some of our summer campers from 3 years ago now. And we showed them the photos and then got out the same equipment the researchers use at Archbold. They were able to pose, pick what kind of scientists they wanted to be, and pose. Some of them actually posed like their relatives, because here's Serenity, that's her dad, Stefan, who's an Archbold biologist, so she wanted to pose like him. Ava wanted to be like her big sister, Lexi, who some of you have seen because she's been on this program before. They also wrote just a little bit about either why they picked a certain kind of scientist to dress like, or put some of their thoughts on here. So let's look at a few of these. Chloe likes birds. Alan is telling us we need to treat nature with kindness. Emily loves the earth, loves the sea, loves fire, air, and life, her life, and she wants to save the animals. She has a Florida Panther track in her hand. Jocelyn loves nature. She thinks it's wonderful. It's something that lights up your future. And I think she's someone who just, when she's out in nature, just feels good. It makes her feel good. Epic. I'm a Homo sapien and an omnivore, a living organism. I need oxygen to survive. I live on a planet called Earth. That is not a real snake in the photo. That's a fake one. Katie, she has a pet bird at home, and that pet bird makes her care about the wild birds and want to protect them. Anthony is interested in doing those things that Alicia is doing in the first photo, doing prescribed fires, or helping manage invasive species, species that are being kind of bullies to the other plants and animals around them. And this one's a little bit tough to read, so I'm going to read the whole thing for you. I think you should treat nature fairly, and you should not pollute nature. I fell in love with nature when I was much younger, when I lived by the woods. I will help any animal that is hurt and not feeling good, and protect nature and the wildlife it has. Take care of the air because we need it. I believe that animals should be treated how we want to be treated. We want to be treated with kindness and be treated fairly. We're all living things. And I have many, many more. We've got about 100 of these, but I'll stop it there. And what I would love is if all of you took some time, maybe not right now, maybe before you go to bed tonight, or maybe if you have a journal, and think about your science self. This project was called My Science Future. And maybe you are a scientist, or maybe someday you'll become a professional scientist. Maybe you won't. That's okay too. No matter who you are, science is still part of your life. Because remember, it's about making observations and learning about the world around you based on observations that you've made and that other people have made. It's a system of learning about how life works around us. So think about the scientist inside of you, and maybe spend some time with that scientist and explore who that person is inside of you. All right, I'm going to put it back to Margaret. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing, Dustin. I love every time he presents with those pictures. I think they're just incredible. Especially, I love my favorite son is Lexi and her sister. If you can't tell, because I really like my older sister and invited here today. My sister's been a huge inspiration for me, and I think those pictures are just amazing. That's really all I have to say for today. If we have any questions, I would love to answer them. You can ask Dustin about his project. You can ask Frances about her research. Laura, do you see any questions?
I don't see any questions now. If anyone would like to put anything in the chat or use the Q&A button, I'll be happy to read them.
I have a question for Frances. I'm going to put your video back on. Well, first, just thanks so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have you. I was curious where your data comes from. You were showing like a cool weather station there. Archbold, we have weather stations, and we give the data to the National Weather Service. Do you ever get data from them?
Yeah, I use data from most of those different sources. So sometimes weather data, and we have great monitoring data all across the country, which it makes it so much easier to be a scientist, because we can get like the weather data from the National Weather Service from all these different field sites. So it allows us to make comparisons between sites. So we use data from the National Weather Service or from the US Geological Survey. They monitor things like rivers, and I'm really interested in water. And so, yeah, that's how I get a lot of my data, through the different monitoring stations.
That's so cool. Archbold, we have a number of research priorities, and one of them is understanding and adapting to climate change. But we actually don't have anybody who's a climate change scientist. Like, that's not a job here. And I think part of that is because the scope is so big. So it's so wonderful to see that the data that we're collecting in our one location here, there's all these other places around the world doing that. And then you take it all together and help us understand it.
Yeah, and it's really important to collect that data because we want to know how things are changing over long periods of time. There's all these different reasons why things change. Sometimes it's just things like, maybe you've heard of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or these different climate patterns. And so to have the really long data collected is super important for science. And also to have it in different places so we can say, are we seeing the same patterns in these two different places? And so that's really important to collect that.
Awesome.
I have a quick question for Francis. I just think it's interesting. If you're able to, do you want to explain a little bit more what you do about your research, just maybe in a sentence or two? I know you have a lot of different papers that you've worked on and published, but just maybe a little bit more specifics.
Yeah. So my research focus, I kind of gave you a broad overview, but what I'm specifically working on is extreme precipitation. So I try to understand the different things in the atmosphere that cause extreme precipitation. And I use a lot of observations. So like Dustin mentioned, these observations that are collected in all these different places. And so we look at what were the conditions that, that made that extreme precipitation occur. And we're trying to understand whether there's changes and how frequent those conditions are occurring, and just try to predict those events better so that we can do a better job. So extreme precipitation often causes flooding, and we want to know, where's it going to flood? So should I build my house here, or should I build it somewhere else? And so we try to understand over the long term, what are the risks from these events, so that people or land managers can use that information to make better decisions when they're trying to manage land or trying to restore an ecosystem, or in an urban environment to understand where we plan those sorts of things. So I try to understand risks from extreme precipitation. And
awesome.
oh yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I see we have a question. I can't read it necessarily from, oh, here we go. Francis, is your work entirely US based, or do you study global patterns? And then there's a question for Dustin afterwards.
I do a little bit of both, and that's why it's really cool to be able to have these monitoring networks that then all provide data to sort of central locations. So it means I can study these things in one location, but then I can also, like satellites give us information about the whole globe. So I can take what I learn in one place and then say, okay, where else in the world does that apply? So I try to do a little bit of both, because you want to understand the specific environment in a specific geographic location, but I also really like looking for global patterns.
And then Dustin, the question is, how far back in time do your photos go? And do you know if any of those children have moved further on for science career paths?
Well, I've been doing that portrait project since 2014. So for the adults and the adult portrait project, I've been able to watch them go through some of their careers, and some of the people have passed on too. So it's nice to have a really wonderful portrait of them doing what they love in their late stages of their career. For the kids, I only was able to do it 1 year so far. We did that in 2019, and then I thought, oh, maybe we'll do it last year, and then we couldn't have summer camp. And then this summer, we're being mostly virtual, so I don't know if we'll get a chance to do any portraits like that. But we have photos of kids coming to our camp for years. Our camp started in 1992, was their first summer. And some of those kids work at Archbold as biologists now. Lexi, in that photo you saw her younger sister, Eva, but Lexi was a summer camper when she was 7 years old at Archbold. And we have another researcher, Alan Rivera, who has been on as a guest on this before. He was a summer camper. And some of the local high school students that have competed at really high levels in science fairs and gone to international have been summer campers at Archbold. So they don't all become wildlife biologists or conservation biologists. But if you're a kid that's really interested in science, whether that's veterinary, medicine, or what have you, coming to Archbold summer camp is a really good resource for those kids.
I saw the question wondering where and who I work for. So I do work at Archbold, and I am education intern underneath Dustin. So he is my boss. We're about 12 feet away from each other right now. I'm just outside and he's inside for COVID protocols. But I do work with Dustin. It's just us two in our department, and then some awesome volunteers. And then we often bring in our researchers here to come talk and do things like this. And then I saw Dustin mentioned our other sister. Our other sister's name is Ellen, and she's an engineer. So that's a whole different type of science that we're getting into. But she built exoskeletons, which can be used for things like natural disaster relief, or also right now, or was recently contracted by Delta. So helping to build planes, which is really cool. Very, very different from what Francis and I do. So I don't know if either of us can speak too much to it. Fran, do you have anything to add to that? No, yeah, that's about all I can say on that. I don't want to say anything incorrect, so.
Can you imagine how proud their parents must be? They've got these 3 daughters changing the world. It's pretty awesome. I did want to mention about Margaret's position here. When she introduced herself at the beginning, she had this long title, the Jill Abrahamson Memorial Environmental Education Intern. We have lots of interns at Archbold. We've had over 500 interns over the years, mostly research. But we have this wonderful position in the Environmental Education Department that's funded by the Abrahamsons. So she's here for 9 months and helps with field trips and helps with summer camp, and gets to go to education conferences and that kind of thing. So thank you. The Abrahamsons, they're wonderful scientists that do work here as well, Abe and Chris. And shout out, we are a nonprofit, so we never really put in plugs for donations, but the work here, needs funding. We are a nonprofit. Just putting a little plug out there.
Yeah, absolutely. The Abrahamsons are a wonderful, wonderful family. And I'm so, so thankful for them. They're very supportive as well. So it's great that I'm able to have a relationship with them as well as be able to work here. I don't think that I've seen any other questions. So I think we'll wrap it up today. If for some reason we missed one, we will send an email out as always afterwards, if you've signed up for this, with all of the information that we talked about in this talk and any questions that we missed. So thank you.
Margaret, I do see one thing there from Karen.
Absolutely.
How can we support? Just go to the Archbold website, just the main website has a donation page on there. And if you're interested in something more than that, we have somebody who's a fundraising director here. So if you really wanted to do something like endow an internship or position, then you can get into all that stuff with our fundraising director. But if you want to donate $10 or whatever, just go to our website and hit the donate button. Thank you. Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, awesome. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Okay, now I believe that we don't have more questions, so I'll wrap it up. Thank you so much to Dustin and Francis. Dustin, who's usually here, but in a different way today, and then Francis for taking time. It's very early in California, so she is awesome for coming on and talking to us today. And thank you to all of you for coming and watching. We will be on next Tuesday at 9:30 again. And we have a herpetology and restoration ecology intern as our guest. And that's, I think, all I have to say. Our summer camp registration should be coming out soon, or summer club, excuse me. So keep an eye out for that on our Facebook page. And that's it. So thank you all so much and have a good week.